So Dr. Glen Slater, very remarkable person. Glen has guided the depth and archetypal psychology program at Pacifica Institute for over 20 years. That's an amazing accomplishment and so significant, because out of that come the people who will develop and carry on in archetypal psychology. It's one of the probably the only place where that occurs, and Glen is key to that. He was the editor of the volume on puer senex that I guess it was 2 years ago we had the conference on puer senex volume. Glen has I think spoken in nearly all of these conferences. He just returned from Australia, where in Melbourne he helped set up a new center for archetypal Jungian psychology. It's just great. He's writing a book that's an extraordinarily interesting theme on the psychology of the post-human movement. The post-human movement. You know, living in the digital age. It's like, you know, this person, Anthony Lewandowski. Anthony Lewandowski is the genius behind the technology for driverless cars. He's the one that. Yeah. Well, in 2013, Lewandowski started the Church of the Future. The Church of the Future that is devoted to singularity, devoted to the surpassing of the human by the robot. So that's what you're going to deal with Hermes and Hermes inflation. Thank you.
Okay, it's very good to be here. Thank you, Robert. I could hear the subtext of talking about my book was good luck with that. I'm going to begin with a quote from the volume. Hermes has become secular messenger, no longer of the gods, and instead infiltrated with the monotheism that has lost its viable credibility as Lord of all dominion. The former omniscience has become overall broadband reach. Omnipotence, the virtual reality that can stimulate all things. And monotheism's divine omnipresence, the instantaneity of ethereal connections and satellite photography that observe and map every phenomenon on the planet. That was in the late 1990s. When repotting plants, it helps to loosen the root ball and untangle the roots. In the case of Hillman's 1998 essay, Hermetic Intoxication, the phenomenon it focuses upon, namely the psychological character of the information age, has changed considerably in the 2 decades hence, to the point of now defining much of contemporary existence. Deeply implicated in everything from personal identity to communal life to political power. And in order to replant Hillman's insights in today's cultural situation, I think it helps to tend some essential roots of his perspective and recall the ways in which Jung wrote about the gods in psychological life. So I want to step back a little bit, and I think this is particularly relevant to this topic, maybe other topics today. 2 notions in particular stand out. The first goes back to symbols of transformation, where Jung wrote of the gods and religious icons as libidinal analogies and described the canalization of libido, psychic energy, that takes place by means of these symbols. Such symbol formation isn't only a redirection of libido, like a sublimation in the Freudian sense, but a transformation of it. Mythic images rising to a certain level of symbolic significance transform psychological impulses. Or, to quote one of Dr. Kwame Scruggs' budding mythologists, a myth is a bizarre story that could change the way a person acts. Isn't that great? The second notion relates to Jung's early understanding that the rise of depth psychology occurs against a background of religious decline. More pointedly, the decline of symbolic and ritual life. The implication of this modern cultural shift, stated bluntly by Jung, is that the archetypes have come loose from their moorings, meaning libidinal energy, expressed according to primordial patterns of behavior and value, have lost their channels of transformation and are left to fuel complexes and neurotic impulses. This notion is best expressed in Jung's now famous statement, "The gods have become diseases," which Hillman took as a guiding principle in understanding psychological malady. In short, today the gods may be found far more readily in compulsive behaviors than in the remnants of religion. Sources of spiritual sustenance and the search for ultimate values have left the churches, so that the underlying religious impulse has become, in the words of Mark C. Taylor, most interesting where least obvious. Golf is a religion. The NRA is a religion. But Catholicism is mostly a squabble between conservative moralists and liberal champions of social justice. And American Protestantism has become a hothouse for rationalization, dissociation, and spiritual escapism. One way or another, the gods have become most evident in those places where we're most split, most troubled, most neurotic. One more piece for this background. There's a pivot between these two situations, between the gods having a functional libido, functioning as libidinal analogies, and the gods driving us to madness, which has to do with the ability to perceive and respond to the powers these personified figures stand for. This ability seems to make all the difference. As you know, in his 1937 Terry Lectures, Jung referred to this pivot as a religious attitude, a careful observation and consideration of certain dynamic factors, whether spirits, demons, gods, laws, ideas, ideals, paying attention to what has force over us. And in Hillman's 1972 Terry Lectures, he argued that the preoccupation or vocation of our work is, quote, one of recollecting the gods in all psychological activity. Find a myth in the mess. Hillman goes on to say, when we're aware of ritual, sacrifice, and creedal teaching, then we're less likely to enact them blindly. Without religious ideas, we're prey to them elsewhere as ideologies. Note here the necessary interdependence of psychology and religion. To be psychological, in this way of thinking, to any depth requires a religious sensibility. Yet today we have neither a depth psychology nor a religious attitude. So, with these roots now dangling before us, we're ready to take a good look at the insight Hillman planted at the turn of the millennium, namely, that we've turned to the internet with religious fervor, looking for meaning, if not salvation, in increased connectivity and the exchange of data. And at the very same time, the internet, both individually and collectively, evidently is driving us mad. Hillman's early psycho-religious diagnosis of this ubiquitous trend is that a monotheism of Hermes holds us in thrall, which is to say, yoked, controlled, gripped, or tyrannized. The face of this phenomenon relates to, quoting him, the fascination with exchange between peoples everywhere, the hypercommunication of globalism, the emphasis on trade and finance, the instantaneity offered by electronics. However, the underbelly was already showing through 2 decades ago. Again, Hillman, what was once chronic long-term investment is now a quick Hermes turnover. Giant shifts of money are shadowed by giant scams and thefts, by laundering and deceptions. With this hypertrophy of Hermes, money is no longer solid coin, nor backed by gold, only words and numbers, mere messages sent by electronic data processing. So putting his finger on the character of the syndrome, he writes of the appetite for information and pointing out something really critical, I think, that Hermes is an indiscriminate messenger. Hillman expressed these concerns before the iPhone, before Lehman Brothers, and before the rise of fake news. Now it seems fair to say indiscriminate messaging is mirrored by an equally indiscriminate comprehension. With great segments of American society having lost effective means by which to navigate the hyper-reality of cyberspace. Recently, the internet became the tail that wags the dog of world politics, a dark trickster eroding the line between information and misinformation. Hermes is no longer just an intoxicating agent, he rules the planet, even though you can't find him on Google Earth. To Hillman's earlier question, could Hermes be playing a computer video game with the whole world, we must now answer a resounding yes. So we see the problem. Now let's try a psychological response, the detox. Locating a God in a problem typically suggests the relationship with that God might be better. It allows us to start seeing images that invite awareness and libidinal investment in order to release a kind of archetypal medicine, something that would shake up the enthrallment. What fixes a hypertrophy of Hermes is more, not less, Hermetic awareness. We may appreciate Hillman's observation that search engines and online encyclopedias, to quote him again, resurrect the ghost of ancient Hermeticism, that vast collection of occult wisdom literature, mnemonic images, symbols, and magical practices aimed at the mastery of all knowledge. It's Hillman. Yet, I think we have to realize this resurrection is more of an archetypal tease than anything else. Isn't it the promise and possibility of world knowledge that constitutes the siren call of the internet? This promise and possibility is, however, quite different from the knowing and the realizing. And it's just right here that we see the way we've identified with one aspect of this God and left the rest of him behind. For surely an actual Hermeticism involves a depth of knowing. Surely it involves levels and layers that lead to actual understanding, possibly even to wisdom. The internet Hermes leaves passage to the underworld behind, traveling every which way but down. Think of it. What do we mostly do on the internet? We surf, skim along as each new wave of information arises, deciding whether to stay on a page in less than 10 seconds and averaging less than a minute on the pages that are actually engaged. Pause, reflection, contemplation, or depth of any kind is mostly absent. The internet Hermes leaves his situational awareness and intelligence behind also, tearing sound bites away from contexts and complexities, flinging them in all directions. Yet Hermes, we recall, is also the god of interpretation, right? Guiding our efforts to discern meaning and significance amidst the merely informative. Hermes requires a vertical imagination. So my point is this: if the Hermetic tradition is best captured by the aphorism "as above, so below," alluding to the rich interweaving of knowledge about the macrocosm and the microcosm, the online experience is cognitively and stylistically flat, ruled by a hyper-horizontal Hermes who travels neither to the upper world nor to the underworld, but simply traverses the world at increasing speed, with ever freer association, shifting our attention in shrinking increments of time while multiplying the tasks, windows, and screens vying for our focus. No hermetic circling, no hermeneutic circling, spiraling, or deepening in sight. There's not much looking back either. There's not enough time. This is a slightly different horizontality to what Gustavo described yesterday, which Janus looks back and forward, we remember. The dominance of this one archetypal figure prompts awareness of the way communication has fallen into one style, one mode, one sense of what's real. High school kids text one another standing feet apart on the playground. And by the time they get to college, they're terrified of having a one-on-one conversation over dinner. As Hillman puts it, communication can't belong to any one god. And here it's easy to put the archetypal fantasy aside for a moment and simply ask what happens to what he calls, what has happened to what he calls, quoting him, communication by means of the daily delights of life, flowers, cooking, drinking together. Or, he says, communication of teaching and learning, slow, painstaking, proceeding through art and craft. Today, communication seems invalid without leaving a trail in cyberspace, while actuality appears to grow ever more malleable. And I think we need to face this inversion of actuality in cyberspace. Seeing, for example, the way a sense of identity is now formed via social media. Not just a persona, but people's deep sense of identity is now online. Or the way we turn to algorithms to make ever more significant life choices, who we're going to enter a relationship with, medical decisions. For some, on a given day in the world, there's more likelihood of being texted an emoticon than witnessing an actual display of emotion. Just as we must dig into what a conscious engagement with Hermes invites, a fuller engagement, and cultivate space for this archetypal figure to flourish and display the fullness of his character, we can follow Hillman's prompting to consider the way any god's nature is configured in relation to other gods. That is, we also reverse the possessive grip of one archetype by recovering its relational network. No god appears alone, as Joanne reminded us. Hillman puts it thusly: what can free us of this addiction to instant access and delivery, this delight in the invisible passage of anonymous words through the air, this privilege of possible connection to everyone, anywhere? His answer: Hestia. And I don't want to go into all the qualities of Hestia. Natalie's going to be talking about that, but I do want to mention that Hestia was the first Olympian god to be swallowed by Kronos and the last to be released from his belly. So she knows a thing or two about incubation and patience. Her association with the hearth means she brings what Hillman calls a sense of refuge and stillness. And he argues here and elsewhere in the same volume about Hestia's devotion to inwardness. The point is to underscore how much such a divine relationship involves a cross-fertilization, if we bring Hestia and Hermes together, and a mitigation of essential archetypal qualities, not merely a balancing act. It only takes a little bit of consciousness of today's cyber tyranny to separate the intoxicating Hermes and the homey Hestia by interspersing our manic push-through email with a spot of meditation by the fireplace, or injecting a short stint at the dinner table into 5 hours on World of Warcraft. So that would be taking the two of them and kind of giving a little bit of time to each, but they're still polarized. A deeper invocation of Hestia would awaken a felt sense of the faculties and psychic processes our migration into cyberspace is leaving behind. The dire need for lingering thoughts and dwelling emotions, a communing with what is right before us. As Hillman argues, a sense of place. He says that a sense of place frees us from the anxiety of time. A renewed feeling for what is central, for what matters. Hestia, I think, asks that we remember essence. If we could grasp what is essential, maybe we wouldn't need to spend so much time searching. So absent this Hermes-Hestia configuration, I find this to be one of the most compelling parts of this essay. We find ourselves unconsciously bouncing between the worst, most polarized expression of the two. Hillman puts it this way: as Hermes can go mad with Hermetic intoxication when severed from Hestia, so a monotheism of Hestia becomes only fanatical purity, fanatical devotion, a single focus on home, homeland, and family relations. No contact with other. They become an evil empire, an axis of evil. Communication becomes contamination. No nuance, no ambiguity, no Hermes. Sounds familiar. Hacked emails, WikiLeaks, and a Facebook frenzy of fabrication on one side and a 2,000-mile wall on the other. electronic trickery in a world whose circumference is everywhere and center is nowhere, locked in a tumble with a concretization of home and a paranoid protection of tribal identity. This is Hermes and Hestia on an unconscious binge. The antidote to this mess would entail a combination of Hermetic understanding and Hestian interiority. But let's just settle for understanding and interiority, enough to offset the worst excesses of archetypal enthrallment. So instead of being driven, can we not imagine into what's driving us? Is it still trying to fill the existential hole of the 20th century? Is it thinking the brain works just like a computer and educating our kids accordingly? Is it that our primary means of coping with anything these days is numbing and dissociation? Or do we have to face the question of religion all over again on a whole new level? Maybe all of these. We don't need to name the gods as such, or mythological images of archetypal thought, to perceive and place the rich array of values and contexts that have been displaced by the cyber trickster. But I think Jung and Hillman's pivotal awareness of the way religious impulses travel underground may be essential. Awareness of being in the grip of something larger than the impulse to innovate or just affect blind market forces. It's in this spirit of understanding that Hillman's hypertrophy of Hermes has been recognized elsewhere, described by the Israeli historian Yuval Harari as dataism, a faith that the ever-increasing speed and volume of stripped-down, sorted information will eventually unlock all the secrets of the universe, solve any problem that's thrown at us, and finally allow algorithms and artificial intelligence to set off our intellectual shortcomings and decide on a fitting direction for the entire planet. For after all, now even biology promotes the view that we ourselves have simply become highly complex information systems, which will be eventually decoded and re-engineered. So suddenly enthrallment seems more like tyranny as we allow the very nature of being to be defined according to the conduits and consumption of data. So as we're looking for a way beyond this digital life run amok, we face a culture doubling down on data and corporations preparing the way for a quasi-spiritual state of techno-humanism, wherein the horizontal hypertrophy of Hermes permeates all aspects of existence. As Harari puts it, the shifting of authority from humans to algorithms is happening all around us, not as a result of some momentous government decision, and I'm finishing up here, but due to a flood of mundane personal choices. If these choices line up in one direction, the individual will transpire to be nothing but a religious fantasy. Reality will be a mesh of biochemical and electronic algorithms without clear borders, without individual hubs. An unconscious religious fantasy in which we lose all capacity to maintain borders and hubs. Surely this underscores the very imperatives of archetypal thought to get inside into the roots of this decoupling of intelligence and consciousness. That's Harari's big argument. That's the precipice we're on. We've started to decouple intelligence and consciousness. And of course, consciousness for us in the archetypal world means becoming conscious of the powers acting upon us, so we can cultivate the neglected values this recognition of the gods calls forth. Thank you.